All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Michael Grahowski, he, him. I'm on DSA staff as the events coordinator. And I was the person who bottom line convention on staff. And I'll pass it to Walker if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Walker Green, he, him pronouns from Metro DC DSA chapter. And I help bottom line the creation of the Airtable system and the voting and all that fun stuff that you saw at the convention.
Hey, I'm Khalil, he, him. I'm the software developer on staff. I kind of came in towards the end and assisted Walker with building out the Airtable on some of the more technical coding parts of it.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen. We have some slides. There's a lot of info that we're going to go over tonight. Okay. All right, so the agenda for tonight, we're just going to go over 3 categories of things. The first thing is what we learned. So we're going to go over a few of the things that we considered when we were making decisions on how to run this. Talk through a couple of options that you might use in your chapter, including building a system like this. Next, we will talk about why we built this system. I'll say up front, like, we saved a lot of money, but we didn't do this as a cost saving measure. We did this because this was the best system that we could provide for convention, and we'll talk about why. And then lastly, Walker will do a deep dive on how everything works. And we'll have a questionnaire that we'll make available. If you want to learn how to build a system like this, we'll have a follow-up call that'll be more technical, where Walker and Khalil will run people through how to build a system like this. So even if it's not you, you could find someone in your chapter who feels pretty confident, and they can be the person who learns how to build a system like this. All right, so next up, so first off, what we learned. So just a quick summary, the tech tools that we used was a combination of these 5 things. First, Cadence, and I'll talk a little bit more about Cadence in a second. Cadence linked out to Zoom meetings. And so Cadence is like the hotel, the place where we gathered, and then the Zoom meetings were like the breakout spaces at convention. Airtable is what we used and what we'll talk the most about tonight. That's what we used for the voting system. Then we had a DSA Convention hub on the website where we try to put as much information and links to things in one place. Then lastly, we had OpaVote for leadership election. So those 5 things put together is how we ran convention. So first up, Cadence. So I'll just say Cadence, the point of this is that we would have a secure way to get people to the sessions. So we couldn't just give people Zoom links because those Zoom links could be spread and shared everywhere. We had the Zoom links embedded into Cadence so that if you were registered and your membership was verified, you would get a Cadence invitation, and then you can get into Cadence and get to whatever session you were going to. Cadence, I think, like, you know, looking back, we tried to add a lot of stuff. I don't know if we needed all of it, but it was worth trying. We want to at least give people more than just like a list of Zoom links. We want to try to have it look appealing, have like a list of attendees that you can like meet other people, have the photo booth, the solidarity journal tables, stuff like that. So that's what Cadence was for, is to move people from one place to another place in an efficient way and in a secure way. And then we also have really good data from Cadence. We know exactly who attended which session. We have lists that we can follow up with people. So that was the reason why we used Cadence as our home base. Next, the convention hub. So this is something that we first came up with, and I think Walker probably came up with it when we did the YDSA convention in 2020. That was our first virtual convention. And we put everything into one place so that it would hopefully be as easy as possible for delegates to find information. The challenge with convention is always that there's so much information, and it's really important for the sake of our democracy that we provide everything to people. Then we have to figure out how do we provide it in a way that's not so overwhelming that they don't actually access it. And it almost like becomes counterintuitive, where you get all the information you need, you get a 200-page packet, but it's so much that you don't actually engage with it. So we try to come up with some ways to get information all in one place so that delegates would actually find it relatively easy to engage with. I think it's something we're still figuring out, but the convention hub was one of the things that we tried this time. And to run through a couple of options we considered. So we considered doing raised hands on Zoom. We considered Google Forms and Sheets. We considered third-party voting software, and then Airtable, which will be landed on. And I'll go through the first three really quick, and then we'll get more into why we chose Airtable. So raised hands on Zoom, we use that at times during convention. So we used it for objections. And so we could ask for acclamation and see if things that were not controversial could just pass without objection. We had a threshold of 100 objections. So we saw 100 hands. We knew that the body wanted to vote on it instead of just passing it by acclamation. We also use raised hands for seconding things, but we couldn't use it for voting because we couldn't ensure that, because we had delegates, alternates, staff, and some volunteers all in the Zoom. So we used raised hands. We couldn't ensure who was voting. We couldn't ensure that chapters had the appropriate amount of votes, like for proxy voting. And we couldn't ensure that alternates and delegates were accounted for in an efficient way. But this could be an option though, if you have a smaller chapter, if you're doing like a smaller annual meeting type decision-making meeting or just a branch meeting, you could use raised hands to do voting. Next, we use Google Forms and Sheets for the 2020 YDSA convention. Walker similarly built this system out before he built the Airtable system this year. And it worked in a lot of ways, but we tested its limits at just 150 to 200 people. So we don't recommend doing Google Sheets for a medium to large convention, but it might be an option for a smaller chapter. But we did it with YDSA for like under 200 people, and we basically crashed our Google Sheets a few times. And then lastly, we tried some third-party voting systems. The two that we considered most were eBallot and Direct Vote Live. I can't speak too much to them, whether or not I would recommend them. They do have a pretty significant cost for a chapter. But the reason why we didn't go with them is it couldn't do all the things we needed it to do. And so we'll talk in a minute about why we chose Airtable and why we needed something that could do. Basically, we needed a more dynamic system that we had to build so that we could meet the unique challenges of a DSA convention. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is pass it to Walker to talk about why we built this system. And Walker, just let me know when to go to the next slide.
Yeah, sure thing. Hey, hi everyone, my name is Walker Green, he, him. So what the DSA convention needed, and this is kind of why we landed on Airtable. We needed immediate credentialing and decredentialing of delegates. No other mass organization has a need to put people on a roster and take people off a roster mid-convention, mid-vote. So a lot of softwares out there, usually your voting list, list of voters is usually static. So we need the ability to change that on the whim. Substitution voting for alternates and proxy voting for delegates. So the ability to change one person's ability to vote, how many times they can vote, we assume everyone has one ballot, but if they're voting for two people, then they have two ballots, or if they're subbing in for a person between the hours of 12 to 3, they have a certain amount of votes, right? So we needed the ability to change people's voting power at certain times. We needed to be able to handle different voting thresholds, like 10%, 1/3, 2/3, majority. Most softwares is usually just majority and 2/3. We needed a permanent record of all the ballot submissions, which can be edited later. So in case someone actually voted the wrong way and there's a technical issue, that was a thing we could fix easily. A centralized support system with a messaging capability. So given that this is the first online convention for an organization this big, we needed a robust way to handle a lot of technical issues and requests for help through a system that's centralized. And we needed to be able to tell who's actively participating. So in Robert's rules, there's a concept of having quorum, the minimum amount of people you need to legitimately conduct business. But when everyone's behind a screen, that's really hard to tell. So we had to create a way for people to sign in and monitor that to know how many people are actually here. We needed a way to handle stack requests. So whenever someone wanted to make a motion or debate something or debate someone else's motion, we needed a way to handle what is pending, what is not pending, what is something that you can talk about now, and tracking the number of times delegates have spoken, because we want to prioritize people who haven't spoken less. And then we also, part of this is kind of codified Robert's rules. So Robert's rules is a very robust book. It's like 1,000 pages. Most people don't read it. but it has a lot of crucial information like certain voting thresholds, what can be seconded, what can be interrupted. So we were able to create a formula that kind of pulls from the book and attaches it to the system we've created, which is something we'll go over in a little bit. Next slide, Michael. We needed a way to validate submission. So like, what if the form links get leaked on Twitter? What if someone is trying to vote for Michael, right? Like, how do we verify that Michael is who they say they are? Or who am I? Who am I? No, if a delegate is who they say they are when they're trying to vote. So we need a way to validate that. We needed basically, there's a huge list of things we need to customize. So as you can tell, DSA is very unique needs. Airtable has the ability, it's like the limit is your kind of your imagination. So we had the ability to basically configure any feature, any tool, anything we needed, we can just script it right away. And the cool thing with Airtable, we needed a system that can work with a small team of people, staff and volunteers, with limited technology. Not everyone is a computer programmer. I am not a computer programmer. Khalil is a computer programmer. He's a software developer for staff. Most people aren't. So we need a system that where most volunteers or people helping out the convention can just use it intuitively, get it, how it works. So that's one of what we needed. A public vote record, so something that we can share right away after the convention or mid-convention so people see how they voted. We needed accessible forms, right? So the forms itself can be read by screen reader with that need that accessibility need. A lot of voting softwares are not screen reader accessible, which is disenfranchising a group of people. Spanish forms, we had monolingual Spanish speakers at the convention, which was really cool. So we needed the ability to create a form that serve them, a form in Spanish for voting, for signing in, for those kind of things, and the ability to create motions in advance. So DSA is also unique in the way that we have a lot of complex motions, a lot of Robert rules. It's almost like the Super Bowl of Robert's rules, and we need the ability to predict or plan in advance for certain parliamentary motions in advance instead of on the fly. So which we'll go in later, but we needed the ability to just say, hey, these 5 motions are going to happen. This is what it'll do. This is the voting threshold. We needed to plan in advance, right? These are really hard to do live. It's even harder to do online. So we needed to plan in advance. So there's more, but that's kind of like the TLDR of what we needed it to do. And no other system could do it besides this Airtable system. Go ahead, Michael. And why Airtable? Okay, so like there is Google Sheets. There are those other options. This is just my I don't work for Airtable, which I did, wish they paid me. But it has the familiarity of a spreadsheet, but it's powerful as a database, right? So it's more than just a spreadsheet like for accounting. It has a lot of powerful backend formulas working, kind of runs on SQL and among other things. So if that doesn't mean anything to you, that's okay. It's a powerful database. Has the ability to share any kind of viewing feature. We can customize any specific views and share certain views to be public. So when we want to share public voting records or who's proxy voting, we can do that with any piece of data we wanted to share, we can do that. Also touch on the custom build applications and scripts. So there's a certain, like you get this package, this is what Airtable can do. But then once you throw in custom coding and scripts with JavaScript, you can actually do so much more, which isn't, well, I guess in theory, you could do that with Google Sheets, but that's a conversation for another day. Then automation. So if you're already familiar with software like Zapier, Airtable has automations already built in. So you can make custom notifications, you could automate any tasks, you can make it integrate with certain software. So you can do, the reason a small team is allowed to service a big convention is because the automations and things we program in does a lot of the heavy lifting, which is a unique feature of Airtable. And it has a robust API, which is basically what you can use to program certain things, to make certain cells do certain things. It pairs all with Slack. If you went to the convention, we use the Slack workspace for notifications and email. So when sending out mass email notifications, like, hey, we got your support ticket, things like that, which we can go over later. It's also a relational database again. So it's basically just designed to store a lot of data. We're talking 1,200 delegates, 300 alternates, thousands upon thousands of voting ballots. Each one is a unique record, right? So this has the ability to scale. You can edit, it's easily editable. You can add to it, you can delete it in a way that Google Sheets just can't. There's various types of fields, and this is like, there's a lot of things that I can't go over because that's what the technical call is for. We'll tell you to go to the part 2 training, but there's a technical call to go over like what all this stuff means. If this sounds like a foreign language, I'm really sorry. I'm trying to do my best to make this as accessible as possible. But basically, there's a lot of different field types and different formulas and different things you can do with the different columns and rows in Airtable that kind of services our needs. And Airtable includes custom apps, or you can use some of the Airtable apps, which is kind of like how an iPhone has an app store. Airtable has an app store where you can download different apps to basically boost up your Airtable base, from like scripts that deduplicate to importing CSVs, right? If you have a large membership list, you can, or merging. So there's a bunch to choose from, which makes the work easier. And like I talked about, the extensibility. So JavaScript also uses React as well, but if you know JavaScript, there's a lot more you can do, which is a lot of this is built on, which Khalil kindly helped put together. So a lot of the custom programming, which makes it more than just a regular database, is through JavaScript. And it's a low cost. So we're talking thousands of dollars for other voting software, or $90 per vote. You're talking $25 a month, right? If you just get the monthly plan. If you get the yearly plan, it's $20 a month. So you were talking about relatively low cost, very low cost. It like beats everything else on the market for a tool that can do so much more if you know what you're doing. So that's kind of the reasons why we kind of settled on the Airtable and the things we saw that was made it very useful. Next slide, Michael. Thank you. Okay, so some fun stats. You may have seen this on Twitter. So at the end of the convention, there was over 43,000 ballots cast, individual submissions, over 8,000 automations run, over 2,000 tickets. And you can see there's a lot of things that this could do that in other systems just would not be possible. And all added up to one really successful online convention that was able to do this. It's hard to imagine another system that could do it, but the DSA staff and volunteers pulled it off. So this is kind of what you can look forward to at a local level. Maybe not 43,000 votes, but something smaller. Next slide. And some fun testimonials before we get into the serious stuff. Twitter had a field day, but there's a lot of fun things that happen with Airtable, between signing in for roll call, between crashing the forums, to people using support tickets to try to make parliamentary things happen on the floor. It was a really fun time. We got a lot done. And in the end, we learned a lot, but we also was able to do something that hasn't been done before. So with that said, now let's get into like the more serious, more how this works, how it all works. So again, we're not going to go over the technical nitty gritty. I'm going to do my best to kind of skim through all the different features and what it can do. And at the chapter level, you can either use as many or as little features as you want. You definitely would have to sign up for a part 2 train to actually implement this. So I'm not going to show you how little things work. I'm just going to show you the features that kind of exist as it exists, or as it currently exists. Michael, next slide. Oh yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to do something real quick. So yeah, thanks, Walker. And Walker's about to do a deep dive. One thing I want to do right now, though, while everybody's on, I have a poll, and I want to ask that you all fill out. Let's see, maybe it won't let me do it when I'm screen sharing. 1 second. Here we go. So I'm going to launch a poll. So we want to know if any of you on the call want to learn how to build a voting system. We're also going to provide a questionnaire that we're going to ask you to fill out. We just want to know for, just so we have a list of people. I'll give you about a minute. Fill this out if you are interested in learning how to build a system. That way we know we have a list of people who would like to learn how to do this. And I'll just say, like, I'm definitely not a tech expert. And we have varying levels of experience with this type of thing, like Walker mentioned. We built a team to do this. We figured out who knew how to do which things we needed to do. And so even if you aren't a tech expert, there's a way that you can play a role in making something like this happen for your chapter. All right, so I think we're at a good amount of people. What I mean by building a voting system is to create something like Walker is going to show you. Walker's going to do a deep dive on how the system worked. We're going to do a deep dive on what that system looks like. And we are going to do a follow-up technical call where we'll show people like some steps to create your own system. All right, so we have a lot of people who are interested in learning how to build the system. About 25 people, which is great. All right. So I'm going to put the screen share back on and hand it to you, Walker.
All right, thanks, Michael. Waiting on the slide, Michael. Cool. So with Airtable, again, I'm not going to explain how. I'm going to show you how the voting system works, but not like what is Airtable and like how the basics. Airtable 101. I would recommend doing, and just because of time, I would recommend going to airtable.com, taking one of their like basic training courses to know about the fundamentals of Airtable. I'm just kind of just go in for everyone's sake. So in Airtable, what you're going to be given is a workspace. So in the workspace, it's kind of like it's just like a folder. And in here, we have 6 bases. Each one of these things is called a base, and each one of these is essentially a tool that makes the voting system function. We have a base, the red one is the base that has stack, roll call, substitution, proxy requests, all the credentialing information. Support has the support tickets and how we handle those. Vote totals is the aggregate of all the voting records, how people vote. That's where like, this is the total yes votes, no votes. On each resolution, and ballot 1, 2, and 3 are basically 3 different forms we use for people to cast votes. Because again, at the large scale of the convention, you're talking 1,200 delegates voting at once. So you have a lot of traffic to one form, which causes things to crash. If you remember at the convention, we had a rough start, but we eventually got the groove towards the end, and which I'll go about later. But basically, we reduced traffic by making people use 3 different forms that didn't have any lookup fields, which we'll touch on later. Next slide, Michael. So this is just, if anything, this serves to show you how the confusing the backend is, but I don't want that to deter you. So because this is already created, but basically the reason with Airtable, each one of these cells is essentially a unique record, but they're all linked in one unique way. So Airtable, because it's a relational database, everything is kind of tied together. So we have a lot of tables and a lot of bases, and all the records are tying to do certain things. That list actually goes very long to the bottom. This isn't actually, it's not very helpful for you, but these are things that already has been created. So you don't actually have to worry about building it, but everything's very intricately intertwined with the coding and how everything's linked. But that's just a fun fact, if you will. Next slide. So I think the easiest way to kind of say like how this system works is to refresh you like from the put you in the perspective, like the POV of a delegate attending a convention. And then we'll go by tool and then show you the back end. So if you were signing up for the convention, you would get an email like this, a convention credentials email saying, hey, welcome to the convention. Here's your name, your delegate type, and your key, and here are your unique forms. Right? This is something all the delegates would get. Basically, essentially, they're getting a unique password, which is their delegate key, and unique forms. So when they click it, it'll automatically fill in that password, which is a note on security, which we'll talk about later. But fundamentally, everyone part of this has a name, a delegate key, which is their unique password to them, and unique forms, which is kind of how everything else is built on top of that. Next slide. All right, cool. So first thing, roll call. The first thing with roll call, remember back to the point of how do we know who's actually here? We have 1,000 delegates. You need 501 participating to make anything legitimate. How do you do it? So we have a roll call form. Essentially, people are signing in. Next slide. So it's just a basic form where people will select their name, put in their password, and say what they're signing in. So at a convention, you're not signing in for one meeting. You're signing in for one block out of many blocks, right? Saturday debate block 1, Saturday debate block 2. You're signing in for that session, and then at that session, we determine, we'll say, hey, do we hit quorum? Do we hit the 1/2 of people needed? And this, by signing this form and saying you're here, that turns on most of the other forms that lets you vote, or not vote for in this example, but lets you request stack. Like if I showed up at a meeting or at the convention and I didn't sign in, I would not be able to request stack. I can't debate, I can't make a motion because we don't know you're here. We don't have that data. So this is kind of like a gateway that stops delegates from accessing or doing other actions with other forms or features until they signed in. And that was like just a routine thing at the 1 hour before every debate block. We say, hey, you had to sign in just so we know you're here so we can count that. And this form kind of, once you sign in, it kind of unlocks that for the other forms. And that's through a process of linked records, which we won't really go too much into detail here, but basically one table is looking at another table. And when a status is true, it says, okay, they can vote now, essentially. Next slide. So that's kind of that's the start for a delegate. So we're going to go into stack. So stack is like the process of, I want to debate a motion. I want to make a motion. Like I want to debate resolution 32, or I think we should adjourn now. That process of people wanting to talk, we call that stack. And at the convention, a lot of people want to talk. So in the live convention scenario, everyone is getting in line. The first person to the mic gets to talk, right? In an online convention scenario, you don't have that luxury. What we do have is what we settled on is essentially, next slide, is a form that takes in all of these requests. And we're talking dozens to hundreds of requests per like item that's happening. So we had a form that basically asked them, what do you want to do? Do you want to debate a main motion? Do you want to make a motion? Do you want to debate something pending? Do you want to be removed from stack? Or are you an author that needs to motivate something? Essentially what we did, we virtualized the process of getting in line in an online setting. So the getting in line is you filling out this form, and then we have stack runners who essentially curates that line, right? Because there's a lot of considerations with who gets to speak on stack, right? We have Robert's rules considerations, right? Certain motions have higher class than others. Like point of order usually means you can interrupt and go right away. Main motion means you're at the bottom of the queue, right? Bottom of the priority. So you have Robert's rules, which ranks 22 different motions on who can talk when. And then we have the consideration of, well, we don't want John Doe or Jane Smith talking the whole, like they talked 3 times already. How many times do we have to hear from that person? We should prioritize someone who has spoken less. So one of the cool things is by filling out this form, what the stack runner will see in the back end is all the different requests, and by Robert's rules priority and by how many times they've spoken. And then the stack runner makes the calculation and the recommendation to the chair. This is the line this should be the stack order, right? So essentially, like a bunch of people want to get in line, and then there's a the stack runner is sorting that line by a couple of criterias, which is how we did it for the online convention. So you can go to the next slide. So this is just more expansive view of the form. So if you wanted to make a motion, most people don't know all the Robert's rules motion. I don't blame them, there's too many. But basically there's 22 odd motions, and what you have is a drop down saying, here are different motions you can make. And if they don't know, they can always select other. And what is always required if you see their motion summary, which is a feature that you don't really get in a live convention, is we know in advance what people want to do, right? It's like, I want to appeal the chair. Here's my reason. I want to end debate by 10 minutes. I want to amend this amendment, or I want to make this point of order because X, Y, and Z, right? We are able to see a lot of the requests in advance, or the stack runner is able to, and anything that can be handled off the floor that doesn't, like, for instance, like I didn't get my delegate key, or I am missing an email, or I need this form. That is something a staff member can address and not take up space during the meeting, right? Because in theory, in a live meeting, anyone could make a point of order and make an ask of that, but we don't have the luxury of time. Time is against us. So anything that we can handle that off the floor, not taking up the debate time, actually helps expedite the meeting and allows more debate, which is kind of what people want to do. People really don't, well, with the exception of some people really don't like the procedural stuff that happens because it goes on forever. It's like, how many times are we going to debate an amendment to an amendment, or make a point of order to limit debate, to make an appeal? Like, it just goes on forever, and then they get nothing done. So most people want to handle the substantive stuff. And so this form kind of weeds out the non-substantive stuff, and staff or volunteers try to handle that off the floor. Or if they want to make a motion, we already know in advance. And the cool thing with this is in the Slack, we would have the stack team, which the parliamentarians are part of. So if we get a request that is like super advanced, or we don't know how to handle it, or it's like, what are the logistics procedurally? Like, is this in order? What does the Constitution say? We have a parliamentarian on stack looking at it and letting the chair know in conversation on Slack saying, hey, this is how you should handle this. Or like, there was a thing in the convention that says, like, what is the DSA union saying about this? Well, that is something the chair, I would not know in the moment, but that is something the stack runner can then forward to the ops director or someone that would know that, the answer to that question, right? That's kind of the pros of this, is like we're able to answer things normally that would just would waste a lot of time. So because we know everything in advance. So this is kind of so everyone fill out this form to essentially talk. Next slide. And this is kind of the back end, right? So what we see, it's gonna get more expansive soon. But so we have essentially there's different categories. People can be on stack, they can have the floor. Their motion or requests can be considered or not considered. So essentially what the stack runner is trying to do is group them into different views, right? So we have the list of people that want to talk. What grouping are we putting them in, and how are we ordering that? Next slide. So here is, for example, on the left side, you can see an example stack request order, right? So you see the person that has on floor is listed as number 1. Then you see on stack, the grouping on stack says 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is the stack running, sorting a list, saying, hey, chair, I looked at all the requests. I considered the parliamentary stuff. I considered the amount of times they debated, and this is the amount of time. This is the order I think that you should proceed by. And then the chair uses that as guidance and could go in that order. Usually they do, but sometimes it's like, it might be easier to handle all the requests for information at once and then all the debate at once. But this is kind of what the chair is looking at, what the stack runner is curating. And then on the right side, we have different apps and automations that kind of help with that process. So you're not actually manually typing 2, 3, 4, 5. You're actually running a script that actually populates it. It looks at the view in the Airtable, like what you're seeing is a view, and it's saying it's looking at the order. It runs a script, and it's like, oh, this is the second one in the queue, and it's going to assign 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It may seem simple and unnecessary, but it's actually very handy when you have hundreds of requests like every minute. I guess more realistically, dozens of requests. It's a lot of requests. So you don't have that time to like kind of count it. So essentially what you're doing is the stack runner is dragging and dropping the order, essentially rearranging the line, and they're running a script that kind of assigns it an order number, which I've now, with Philly DSA, we've created an automation for that to kind of help with that process. So that's kind of, it's hard to see it visually because I'm not screen sharing how that works, but it is a process that needs to be done. So that's kind of what happens in any stack order. Next slide. So then now we have a more expanded view. So on the right side, remember how I talked about we codified Robert's rules? On the right side now, it's looking at all the requests, looking at all the debates in motion, and it's telling you, which is a feature that hasn't existed before. We know, can a motion interrupt the speaker? What is the class of that motion? What is can it be debatable, amendable, secondable, or can it be seconded or reconsidered? These are things usually the parliamentarian would know, or a skilled chair just knows because they studied Robert's rules. Most people don't study Robert's rules because they have lives, which is a diss at myself. But what it does now, we've kind of programmed it. It's looking for that value. It's like, okay, this can be seconded, this can be reconsidered. So then the chair or a staff runner who may not know Robert's rules as well knows what those Robert rules traits are and then can sort accordingly. So if in Robert's rules, anything that can interrupt would normally go first, right? In a live meeting, you would cut off debate and they have to address their concern right away. In a virtual setting, that's kind of rough because am I going to unmute you to recognize a point of order, then or put you back on? That's like a lot of wasted transitional time. So instead, we just bump the interrupting motions that would have interrupted to be next on the queue, so to save some of that time. So those are some of the formulas that exist, and then there's a debate number, which it just tells you how many times has that person spoken. So like Sam H from San Francisco has spoken twice. So if all else is equal, then I would probably put them lower if someone else wanted to do the same thing. Cool, next slide. And this is kind of breakdown of the formula. So he uses like a switch formula, which is like a variation like of an if statement. If that doesn't mean anything to you, that's okay. Basically, it's looking. It's saying, hey, what is the motion that's being made? Can it, if it's true, then it says yes. If it's not, then it doesn't say anything. So we have one for interrupt, debate. So essentially, we took the Robert's Rules Index, made a formula out of it. So now there's like an answer for everything. Next slide. Okay, cool. So this may look a little complex. So this is the not considered file. And the thing we've learned over time doing online conventions is when we get a lot of duplicate requests, we get a lot of people wanting to do the same thing. And when it doesn't get considered by they don't get the floor, people get antsy. People get very concerned. Everyone wants their needs addressed right away. In the convention scenario, it is just like one of those things. So like, why didn't you call on me? I wanted to do X, Y, and Z. So we developed the feature with the messaging that we would, if we didn't consider something, basically, if someone wanted to get in line and we didn't put them in line, we would give them a reason why, and then we would send them a message, right? It's like, and you can see there's some examples like, oh, your motion was out of order, or we handled it off the floor, or someone else said the same thing. So a lot of the requests, because when you're looking at 1,200 delegates, chances are there's someone else who wants to do the same thing. There's another person who wants to end debate for just like you, or they want to extend debate by 10 minutes, or they want to appeal the chair. There's a lot of people who want to do the same things. So we have to filter those out. But now we added a messaging component that when we put the reason and say why it's taken care of, That alleviates a lot of concerns because a lot of delegates or a lot of people just want to know that they're heard. They don't want to feel like in the dark. So we kind of put this mechanism so that when someone wants to do something, we tell them, and this is, which will go into the support system later, but we try to make sure everyone's needs or immediate concerns are addressed right away. So it's like, if we can't help you now, we tell you why, or if we can't put you on stack. So that's kind of a cool component, which will then send them a Slack or email notification. Next slide. So this is a more expanded view, right? So Deval from Houston wanted to submit a motion again because CB5 was introduced, so there's an issue, but we said it was not considered because we already took care of it. And then there's some options here. You can see like duplicate motion, handle for other. Next slide. Cool, and these are some, when I talk about Slack bot or Slack notifications and emails, this is kind of what it would look like, right? So when we pair it to Slack, and that's a good thing we'll talk about later, it functions Slack, if you're not familiar, is basically a group chat with a bunch of other group chats. And if everyone has a profile on it, you can get, there's a lot of custom, because we paired it with Slack integration, people get notified when their thing is placed on stack, or if it wasn't considered, or you're next, they'll say, hey, you're number 2, please get ready. And then they're down there, we see there's an email. So it says, the reason it says Philly DSA is because we're trying out this voting system at a local level for Philly DSA's GBM this weekend, as well as Chicago DSA. So that's also we shut down the convention Slack, so I have no place to get screenshots. So this is from that. So those are some notifications that they get, which is useful. Okay, that's right. Okay, motions. So the basis of like Robert's rules is motions, and that's any kind of business. And by business, like what you want to do. Like I want to debate something, or it's like I want to substantially do something. Like I move that Chicago DSA have a pizza party, or I move that DSA endorse Bernie. Like those are motions, or procedural stuff like moving end debate or adjourning. So each of those things is a task that needs to be done and processed by the chair. And that's one of the building blocks that will affect voting and staff, right? Next slide. So I apologize for the pixelization here, but each one of these are example motions from the convention. Each one has a little digit, a little abbreviation M73, so motion 73. And you see M73 to M87 are various motions, right? Some of them are more substantive than others, some are procedural, one of them is a test vote. Like you can see M73 says motion to refer the NPC constitutional bylaw change to the next NPC. So I think that's because we ran out of time. So like, can we toss that to NPC to figure out, right? So each one of these has to be created, and each one of them has a floor status, and that's by Robert's rules sense that like, is it live or not? And in Robert's rules lingo, is it pending or not pending, or has it been considered? So each one of those has a similar value. So these are like, they're not called rows, they're called records in Airtable, and each one has to exist because they'll affect the later process. Next slide. And here's a more expanded view, right? So what we have is a ballot maker that's actually creating ballots, or sorry, a motion maker. The ballot process is different. There's a motion maker creating motions on the fly. They are saying when someone introduces a new motion, they have to create a motion for that, because in the virtual setting, or let's take a step, if in a live meeting, if someone says, I move to do X, someone else can say, I move to do X.5, like they want to make an adjustment to their motion, right? So if you have a main motion and someone wants to amend that motion, you can easily do that live. How do you do that in a virtual setting? Because everyone's muted, no one can talk in the chat, that's very challenging. So what we have here, the motion maker is creating a motion that's happening on the fly, and that affects the stack request form. So on the stack request form, when it's like, I want to debate someone else's pending motion, that is done here. So like, for example, if I wanted to make M1, the DSA national platform pending, when I click that, then it'll show up on the stack request form. So then someone else can say, I want to debate that, or I want to amend that. Or for a procedural thing, I want to refer something to a committee, and then someone wants to amend it to like a different committee. You can do that, and that basically the stack request form is dynamic through using linked records. Basically, that's how it's like turning on and turning off on the forum, because with Robert's rules, you can only talk about things that are pending, that are happening now. I can't debate something that's going to happen in an hour, or it has to be happening now. And how do you do that on a form that's static? So this form is dynamic, and it's adjusted through this, what the motion maker does for the stack process. Balloting is different, but that's how the motion making process is. And you can see there, calculates is a majority. So again, with the codification, it says it's a majority vote or a 2/3 vote. Or if there's a custom vote threshold, you could set it to something else. Next slide. Cool. So this is a more expanded view of the different fields, right? So each one of these things are a field. So you can see on the left, it says motion. So these are the different types of motions you can do, and that's what's on the form. You can see there's a lot, right? Usually there's like 5 that people use the most often, but there's a lot you can do. So it counts for all that. Then the expanded view for floor status, you see the different options. Then you see the vote type formula, which is just a nested if statement. It couldn't be that's a more technical thing I won't get into, but it had to be an if statement to calculate that. And then you can see on the bottom, which says debate or motion. Those are the motions that were turned on, were left pending, like M84 to M89. Oh, Irish Pub, that was a test thing we did in Philly. Those are the motions that could be voted on. Usually only one would be live. Okay, so those are just some of the fields would look. Again, this is already made, so you don't actually have to adjust it. But yeah, next slide. Okay, voting. Okay, so this is the big kahuna. This is the big part of like how the whole system kind of works and why you're all part of it. Okay, so with the voting, there's a lot of technical stuff, but process-wise for the user, and with a lot of other stuff is more involved, but actually the voting process for like tabulating votes is, I would say, quite simple. Once again, it's a lot of this stuff becomes secondhand nature once you practice. It's really just a practice thing. You don't have to learn code. You don't have to really do much more than just practice, like read an instruction, attend a training. We'll show you how to do it. So I wouldn't get too scared. Also, this is like, the bigger the chapter, if it's a convention, the more complicated it gets, because then you have substitution and proxy votes, because ballots are changing, right? So that's dynamic. Everyone's not getting one vote anymore. Everyone could be 1 to 3 votes depending on the hour. But if it's a local general body meeting and it's smaller, everyone has 1 vote. That's easy, right? But those are things that are calculated through the scripts that we've created. So let's just dive into it. Next slide. Okay, so back to this workspace, right? So these are the relevant bases. So essentially a little workspace. Well, these are the relevant bases to make the voting process happen. We have vote totals, ballot 1, 2, and 3, which we talked about. But so the thing with Airtable, one of the limitations is a base can only have up to 50,000 records. You may be like, oh, well, that seems like a lot. Well, for a convention, it's not. When you have 1,200 delegates each vote once, and they vote 10 times, you're already at 10,000 records. You're already 1/5 of your threshold. So if you have a week's worth of conventions, or no, a week's worth of sessions in a convention, that's a lot of votes. That's a lot of records. You will fill up a base with 50,000 records, and then it makes it really slow because then it has loading issues. It can only do so much. 1,200 delegates are voting on a form, right? That's a lot. So we need to break it up. 300. So for convention, it was 400, 400, 400. That's a lot less traffic that people have to deal with. Or that the base has to deal with, right? So if you went to the convention earlier in the week, you notice there was like a lot of loading issues. There was crashing. It was like, and there's more technical explanation to why that worked, and we figured out why it happened that way. But we fixed it by basically splitting up the workload per form and changing certain fields. So ballot 1, 2, and 3 actually syncs up to the vote total base. So you may be assigned ballot 1 or 2 or 3. You'll be only voting on the ballot 1, 2, or 3 form. All those records would aggregate in the vote totals base, which I will go through. Next slide. So when you're voting, you have a form like this, right? You have the name and key. Then you have the option select motion. So again, it is so we want a permanent record of the votes, right? Because we want to know what they are later, and if we need to edit it later on the fly. So each one of these things, the ballot maker actually changes what motion that form applies to. So the default value is the ballot is closed. You select it, it doesn't really do anything, won't let you submit it. Or if you do submit it, it doesn't count towards anything. We're actually changing that. It's a single select field. We're changing it. If we're on M1, it'll say M1. Or if we're on resolution 2, it'll say resolution or R2. We're not actually typing out the full text, right? So in that other base I showed you earlier, it had a predefined list like M73 equals, or it's an M73 DSA national platform. That essentially is a legend, right? Whereas, so this form has a stack, there's already preset M1 to M100. For the convention is M1 to M1000. Realistically, we only did 89 procedural votes. So for a convention, you would have basically a preset list of 100 motions, and the ballot maker would just turn on or turn off certain motions when the time comes to vote, right? So that already exists. And the reason it has to be a static dropdown because it's part of the loading issue or memory and CPU issues that Airtable has when you start. I guess the easiest way to explain it is when you have in the old form, there was one form which was looking at 3 different tables to find the name of who's voting, the vote you're making yes or no, and what you're voting on, right? So essentially one form was making 3 different searches, 3 different lookups to another table. So you have 3 different things. So like it's if that person's traffic was 3, times that by 1,200 people, now you have 3,600 requests. I know that's not technically how it works, and that I'm trying to it's 3,600 requests for something that should only be 1,200 requests. So now we split up in 3 bases, so you have 400 requests, and it's only 400 requests because there's no more lookups. If that doesn't make sense, I'm sorry, we'll learn it at the next training. But that's kind of how it works. Yeah, so next slide. So that's how they would change the ballot. So this is what the backend of one of the ballot bases would look like. These are the different votes. So each one is a group. So those are called groupings. So there's R1, R18, the different things that people are voting on. That goes into that one base, which will then get sent to the vote totals base later. Next slide. And this is what one of the bases could look like, right? You can see here, you see that every ballot has a unique record. So if we need to tie it back to like make a change to someone's yes or no vote, that's how you do it. But you can see here, the first example is Nicholas T from Detroit voted on motion R1 and it's a no vote, right? So that's kind of how the votes come in through the form. And that's kind of what it looks like. This is not really helpful for like a user, but this is how it works. The magic is, well, this is useful for when like a delegate wants to see, did their vote go through or how did other people vote? Because in a live meeting, you can actually see how people raise their placards. So you know how the person at the table next to you is voting. So we're just bringing that principle to the online setting. You kind of see it on a spreadsheet. Next slide. Okay, so this is, again, if the sync basis is still confusing, this is hopefully the arrow helps. So basically those 3 ballots, 1, 2, and 3, all that data goes to the vote totals base, right? So there's one base that is syncing from 3 individual bases, because again, we're splitting up the traffic between 3 ballots, but the actual tabulation, the formula that calculates it, deduplicates it, marks the final result happens in the vote totals base. So the one base is essentially syncing up with the other 3 bases and pulling it. So we have one powerful base that's pulling from 3 smaller bases, and that solved the trafficking issue. So if you remember at the end of the convention, we were able to do votes really quickly. It took people 3 minutes to vote and took 30 seconds to calculate. And a note on that, the 3 minutes to vote, that is a user issue. That is not an Airtable issue. We gave 3 minutes because we were like, people need 3 minutes to open up the browser, get the right link, vote, make their decision and vote, right? That is a thing you can't go around. That is the membership, right? I think Philly DSA, they want it has to be at least a minute. They might actually go a minute or 2 minutes to vote. But it depends on how tech savvy or how used to the voting process your chapter is. But the 3 minutes is not it just took people that long to vote. There's 1,200 people and they need to take their time. But ballot 1, 2, but the actual tabulating is 30 seconds or less because the script runs out, it times out at 30 seconds. So the actual counting is not that long. So just if that helps, right? I would recommend 3 minutes for online, but that's really up to you. But that's more of a chapter thing and a member thing. Okay, next slide. So this is what again, so very similar to the other base. So this is now a synced base. This is now pulling all the votes and for all the different ballots from the 3 different bases in one Airtable base, one big spreadsheet. Next slide. And this is kind of what it looks like on the back end. This is just you right click the tab and it shows you on the left side, you can see it's pulling from ballot 1, 2, and 3. And then on the right side, you see there's an option to sync now. So Airtable inherently, you can sync it automatically syncs every 5 minutes, which is useful for things that you don't need the results right away. But for a meeting like this, we want to know that we can't wait. We don't want 5 minutes to tabulate if we've already closed off voting. So you actually just manually click sync. So that's something the ballot maker would do later. Just click the sync button, then it gets all the data in one base, and then they can start the tabulating process. Next slide. So this is the motions table, right? So we have the ballots table has all the different ballots that are coming in. The motion table is having those are all the different motions, which is synced from the main base. So this is again that legend we talked about, how like what is CB1, and CB1 is strike regional requirements for national conventions, and you can see it has the value. So that's where there's another formula. One of the scripts which we'll talk about actually links that motion to the ballot they select, right? Next slide. Cool. So now to make things more complicated, there's another, which you don't have, it's not more for you, but this is how it's set up. There's a, so that list we just showed you, I just showed you the motions. It's actually pulling from the main base because the ballot maker, I'm sorry if this is gonna be a headache, I'm so sorry. The motion maker is making the motions in the main base because that affects the stack request table or form. But that actually, those values of what the motion is, their voting threshold and requirements, that goes back to the vote totals base. So essentially that vote totals basis has a lot of heavy lifting, but syncing from those 3 ballots for all the ballot records, and then syncing from the main base, the stack base, to get all the motions. So it's really cool. So it's basically everywhere have a base sync. It's kind of like syncception, but that's kind of how it kind of works. All right, next slide. Cool. So this is kind of what the ballot maker would see if they're tabulating votes. So you see the motions on the left side, then you see some, like on the right side, you actually see the results, right? How many ballots are cast, how many total votes are cast. So you can see there's some discrepancy. And again, remember, people have different voting power because some people can vote for alternates could be voting and some delegates aren't voting. They might actually send a duplicate vote, or they are proxy voting for 2 other people because those 2 other people are no longer part of the convention and the chapter is entitled to a certain amount of votes. So the number of actual ballots cast is going to be different from the actual votes that are counted, right? So one delegate who's voting for 2 people is casting 1 ballot, but that's actually 2 votes. So that's usually why there's a difference. And then it tells you what the required vote number is based off of this majority 2/3, and tells you the total yes votes and no votes. And then on the left side here, where you see tabulate votes, the actual tabulating process is triggered by just clicking check mark, right? So ballot maker or tabulator would just click check. It'll have a note saying ballots processing, and it'll spit out a result, say adopted or lost, right? So it's really simple in that perspective. But there's a lot more happening in the back end when the next slide. So if you're actually doing that job, all you have to do is click a little button. But here we have scripts. So this is part of the magic of Airtable, right? You can customize your own scripts through JavaScript with the API. So essentially their little coding language of how to manipulate certain things. So if you go to the slide after scripts, Michael, so we have, this is an automation that's run, right? So when we check something, it runs 2 scripts. And then on the right side, you can actually see the run history. So that's actually telling you when things fail or is not successful. And usually it's because it took too long. There's too many ballots or there's an issue. And I think we fixed most, if not all the issues. So usually if there's any issues, it's just because there's so many bases. You have to archive some votes, again, because there's a limitation of 50,000 records. But that's kind of what you're looking at. So basically there's an automation that runs the scripts for you. You don't actually do anything besides clicking a check mark. And then I'll tell you if it's successful or not. And then I'll give you the final result. Next slide. And this is a little slide before this, Michael. Yeah, there should have been. There we go. So this is like a sneak peek. So this is all kudos to Khalil, the software developer on staff. He created these 2 powerful scripts, which does a lot. This is more for the technical call. It's more of like a super technical call for but basically we have to, because it's a relational database, is a unique record for every delegate. Each delegate has a unique voting power and among other things. So one of the scripts looks through all the delegates, all the submissions from the sync bases, and matches it to a record that exists in the main base. So it's like, okay, John Smith, they voted this way. It's tying that record in the permanent base to the ballot that was cast, because the ballot you're submitting is actually detached because it's no longer a linked record. It's a static. It's just any random string value. Sorry if that's confusing. So it's basically linking a static value in the main base through this script. So it's basically manually linking it. And then it deduplicates it, right? So sometimes people may actually vote twice, or they voted the wrong way and they want to vote the correct way later, right? So if you vote again, this script will take the most recent value. So it's assuming if you vote twice, the second one's the correct one. Or if there's a bad actor, which wasn't really the case, if someone if this was leaked and someone had the delegate key and tried to do 10 votes for one thing when they shouldn't have, it'll get rid of that, so that you get rid of that deduplicating or the bad actor system or issue. And then we have the ability to record the ballot rate, because the script, because the voting power is dynamic, it actually says how many votes was cast at that time. Like 2 votes were cast at that time, because that 2 votes could actually be 1 vote later. So that script does that. Next slide, and we're almost done with these slides. So actually, let me see actually what's relevant. Oh, we should go to question and answer later. we won't have time to go over more, but if anything, that's more of like a sneak peek to what you can look forward to at another call. But there's a whole system with, I guess, can you just skip ahead to the support system? I think that would be good, Michael. And you could just go straight to the slide where it looks like the spreadsheet. The next one. All right, right here. So this is, so again, and this is super important. We can't go over in full detail just because of time. But so basically this is, again, with an online convention, a lot of people want their needs met. Also, there's a lot of technical things happening. It's the first time people are using Airtable. They don't have the right form. They didn't get the email. There's a lot of things happening, or the vote's not working, right? We needed to centralize that in one spot because it's so confusing. And we didn't want people, if you don't create a support system, people are going to DM you, they're going to Slack you, they're going to tweet you, they're going to find a text you, they're going to find a way to get their answer resolved because it is what it is. People want their issue addressed right away. So what we have done is created a similar ticketing system where people, when they submit a form saying what their issue is, on the back end, staffers or volunteers are actually claiming it and writing messages of like how to resolve it, right? So for example, Jessica from New York has a proxy voting issue. So Rachel B claims it, and then they read the request, they go on Slack, they find the answer, go to the Airtable, find the right answer, and they put the reply, here is the answer to your request, right? And they click send. So the cool thing is this support system is paired with Slack and email. So we've narrowed where all the help tickets go to one spot in Airtable. Then you can have a team of like 2-3 people go through a request, claim it, answer it. That way people's needs are addressed right away. And it's kind of like the Domino's methodology. When you order pizza, they tell you, we got your order, John's making your pizza, he put it in the oven, they gave it to the driver, and then the driver's on the way to drop it off, right? It's that, but for support system. So it tells you, we got your ticket, we've assigned it to a staff member, we've found the issue, and here's the solution, right? When you do that, it actually alleviates a lot of tension and a lot of complaints that people don't have to worry about anymore because like we've taken care of their concern. And so there's more to that, but we just don't have time, and I apologize. Just go to the slide. It looks like the Slack slide where you see the little messages. So this is kind of what people receive on Slack, right? It's like, hey, we got your support ticket, or it's been resolved, or here's who's handling. So it's like one of the cool features. Let's send it to email as well. And go to the automation slide. The one right before that one. Right, cool. So there's a lot more. I just can't go over it, but we had like 30, 40 like automations running. So this is like a lot of other program scripts through Airtable that's doing a lot of various tasks and different messaging that we just don't have the time to go over. But so it does the heavy workload for you. And yeah, so that's kind of like, I know that was a lot of information, and I appreciate you all sticking around for like at least an hour to like hear a lot of that. But if this is something you want to do, this is certainly doable. Philly DSA and Chicago DSA are already trying out at the local level. It is certainly doable. You don't have to worry about a lot of programming that's already done. So it's definitely accessible in that way. But it is 9:01, and I do want to leave space for Q&A. So Michael, shall we do that?
All right, yeah, so let's do some Q&A now. So I'll ask the questions, and then we can figure out who can take which part. All right, so the first one we have is, why did we do some voting with Airtable instead of OpaVote? I can just say really quickly, we used OpaVote for the leadership elections. OpaVote works well for what we need to do in terms of electing leaders, but a mix of how expensive OpaVote is, plus it just couldn't do all the things we needed it to do in terms of voting. I don't know if either of you want to talk about why we didn't use OpaVote for.
I believe OpaVote also only, you can only get results through email, which we just decided was way too slow for in-person voting, but like for live voting during convention.
It also costs per vote. So if it's $90 to vote for one thing and you have 89 votes, that's a lot of money. But it makes sense for leadership elections, because if you do like STV or Borda or whatever, there's a lot of magic scripting wise happen. That's something that Airtable is not set up to do now.
All right, let's see. So we have a question. Could a system like this be used to build a consistent voting or record system?
Like of how people voted. Yeah, in theory, yeah. If you want that public link, it's just each base can have 50,000 records, but you can have a base that just has a permanent record of all chapter votes ever if you did that. And you can export as a CSV to store it somewhere else if you wanted.
Hopefully that answered your question, Gary. Let us know if not. Next up is, okay, so we have someone asking, and I think this probably gets into the talking about the technical call, but is there a way to export this so that, let's see. I don't know if I totally understand this question. So if chapters wanted to copy the setup one-to-one, is there a way to codify the schema and automations? Basically, like just give it to someone to work on, like give them a copy of it.
In theory, yeah, you could just copy the base over, but it's a lot more complicated than that, because once you copy it over, you break a lot of the things that are connected. So you have to reconnect the email, the Slack, the different channels, some linking, and then if your chapter has specific needs. But like what I did is like, I'm going to copy it and make a version for Philly DSA, a copy and make a version for Chicago DSA. And then, but yeah, if you know what you're doing, then you can just copy and take it. Chances are you probably don't know where to look, and there isn't exactly a manual yet. Or I don't know if I'll ever have time to make something like that, but it would be very challenging to do that. So it would be beneficial to just like, but that's kind of how you'd get it, right? We'd create a version for you, then you take it, and then we walk you through how to do it at the next call.
Okay. So we have a question. A person attended a hybrid meeting where Zoom participants are basically ignored and in-person participants monopolize the floor. And so they're asking, could something like this be used in a hybrid setting? I'll say to start, I think it definitely could. I think you could use this in person, and people could use it whether they're there or not. But I don't know if Walker or Khalil want to talk about how you might use this in a hybrid way.
You could, I mean, the sky's the limit, but it becomes challenging. Like, how do you, because not every, I'm assuming the people in person aren't going to fill out a stack request form. They're just going to stand up and speak, right? So they could stand up and request the floor. So you'd have the need to have a strong chair, a strong rule that basically how do you give equal time to people online? It's very easy to be tempted to only recognize people in person, but you have to actively, I guess, be looking at the stack request form to recognize people who want to debate or make motions that aren't there, because they're not there to make, in person you can make noise or heckle or do stuff to get attention. You can't really do that online, you're kind of behind a screen. But as long as you have a rule to do that, you could. And at one of Metro DC DSA steering, or we had a steering panel a couple years ago, one of our people like Skyped in and we had like a little monitor where his head would be on the panel and he was like zooming in, talking, giving their speech. So it's certainly possible. It's just you have to find the right rules to make it work to avoid those pitfalls.
Yeah, and I'll just say this gets at the thing we try to do throughout this whole process is you try to brainstorm for potential problems like that and then think of how you might come up with a solution to it. So like Walker's saying, you could have like a way for to track if the delegate is in person or virtual, and then you could look at the stack request list and make sure that you're giving people who are virtual a fair access to getting on stack. All right, so next one, how can we apply lessons learned from online logistics to in-person or hybrid conventions in the future? And then are there specific kinds of functionality for democratic debate and decisions that are only possible in person or only possible virtually? That's a good, like, broader question. I don't know if either of you want to have anything that comes to mind immediately in terms of lessons learned that we could apply to hybrid or in-person conventions.
I think I think the big lesson is that it's certainly possible to make everyone vote and participate remotely, pandemic or not. If like, so Metro DC has a policy where everyone listed as a member can vote. We have this whole process where they send out the resolution so people can vote from home if they're not physically there. But what you can do, whether if that's for you or not, you can use this to make voting on things or decisions or debate more democratic. More people can have a say if they're a member and not physically being there for whatever restriction they may have. I'm not sure about the point about like, can the things that can only happen in person. In theory, I think everything can happen online. The only thing that you would miss is that camaraderie or that like that physical, because I guess like one of the things I feedback I got was like, oh, like I miss like when people was making a procedural thing, they would get like heckled or they couldn't read the room right. So you miss that, pro or not, you miss that live aspect. You can't read the room. You don't know what half the people want to even like end debate, or people are really into this thing. You don't have that, but like that's more of an aesthetic that doesn't fundamentally change can you debate or do something. So I would say you can, anything you could do in person, you could do online if you wanted to. I would be partial. I think you probably should go one way or another. That'd be the easiest. But you could do it hybrid. I think, I don't know limitations though, unless if Khalil wants to add to that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I guess, to slightly disagree with Walker. I think one thing I learned through this, if we could pull this off virtually, I do think we can come up with a way to do hybrid events. And I do think that that's one of the big things we have to figure out over the next year, because there might be ways that some people could get together in person, but some people won't be able to, or who might be at higher risk of being in person. And I've already been trying to think about ways that we can come up with hybrid options. Because if we can figure out how to do this, I think we can figure out how to do hybrid as well. But I do agree though with Walker's point that you have to make a decision. You have to know what you're going to do in advance and have enough time to plan for how you're going to run it according to whatever way that you plan to do it. You shouldn't be switching to virtual like the week before. It's just not possible.
Yeah, it takes.
I just like to.
Oh, go on, sorry.
I just want to say for anyone who's planning to do this too, that just to add to that, that really it's important to practice with this. I think it's just a lot of different skills that are not necessary, like they're not quite the same as it would be in person. And I think it's like very important for your team to be really confident with using it if you're going to do that.
Yeah, if you want to implement this, so what I've learned practicing in Philly and Chicago, it takes at least 3 different training meetings and a mock run to get it running and going and everyone familiar for a GBM, right? So if you want to copy this over to your chapter and use all the same functionality, you have to plan for at least 3 meetings and a mock, so essentially 4 meetings, 2 of them which could be like 2 to 3 hours to practice. It's mostly a practicing thing because it's a very new environment. You probably aren't familiar, so that most of it is just practicing with it so you can do it on the fly. So DSA staff and volunteers, we had to practice for like 2 weeks to get it running for the convention. So you have to plan for that. And then you need a decent team. I would say you need at least like 5 people. Ideally, you have 10 or more people running it. It is a heavy workload. You can, in theory, you can do it with limited people, but like if you want it to like be smooth and just work nicely, you need like at least 5 people. I'm thinking like 10 or more, I think is like what you really want. That may be different between chapters, but yeah.
All right, so I think we're gonna wrap by 15 after. So let's see if there's anything else. We have a question. How tough would it be to build a leadership voting system with Airtable?
It depends on if you're trying to implement a voting threshold that's not majority or whatever. If you're trying to do approval voting or board or SCV, you would have to program that. That doesn't exist. So if you are someone who knows the code to that or know what like mathematical formula to make that work, then I would say go ahead and make it. You can put in JavaScript and try to. I don't know it, so I couldn't do it. But if that's something you need, then you'd have to do more research into figuring out. That's why softwares like OpaVote exist, because they've already figured that out. They have that magic formula. But in theory, if you know it, then yeah, you could do it. But that's right now, this can only handle simple stuff, simple like decimal fractions.
All right, we have some shout out to Walker for helping Philly make their general meeting happen. And looks like Philly has 9 people, not including the chair, parliamentarian, and secretary. Yeah, I would say also just have shifts. I mean, it's difficult work, and it's hard to do for a long period of time. So split people up into shifts and do trainings with everybody, hands-on trainings in advance. All right, let's see if there's anything else that we can cover tonight. Walker, do you want to share the questionnaire in the chat for some who are on, and we'll also email it out to
Yeah. I'll have to pull it up. But what I'm going to share is a questionnaire that if you are interested in attending a part 2 training, a technical call to actually learn that, to actually create one like this for your chapter, please fill out this form. It's basically asking you a lot of details about your chapter, the size, what you're trying to do, what things you want, what features you want, right? Because again, maybe your chapter is like, we're okay with raising hands on Zoom to vote, but we want the stack system because it calculates Robert's rules. You can use any of those features, right? So this questionnaire basically asks you, what is your use case? What are you trying to do? And then when you attend the technical call, we'll try to curate it to you. But I do also disclaimer, so I'm not DSA staff and I don't know how much support going on this can get, right? So after that, we are going to show you the tools. We're going to show you how it works. But I just don't want there to be right now to say there's an expectation that if like, hey, Walker, in 6 months, can you help me build the thing out, right? Like, just so you know, we're going to do our best to show you everything, but there's 1,000 chapters, right? So realistically, we can't build one for everyone, at least at this stage. But we're going to show you our best how to do it. Here's the base. Here's what you need to connect to point. And then you kind of have to run off into the sunset and make it work, right? Get that team, make it happen. But that's kind of what that call is going to be.
Okay. So Walker posted a link. Please fill that out. We'll also email everyone else who isn't here. But yeah, so I think we should wrap up now. I want to thank you all for everyone who's on, everyone who attended. And yeah, I definitely want to thank Walker again. I mean, Walker was essential to making convention possible. I mean, a lot of us put in a ton of work, but Walker just did a huge amount of work as a volunteer on our first virtual convention with YDSA, the YDSA convention this year and this convention as well. And of course, thanks to Khalil for jumping in just a couple months before and building out this system as well. And yeah, so thanks everyone for attending. We will have this follow-up call in the near future, early October probably. And we'll do our best to share as much information as possible. I just got to check with Walker, but I imagine we can share some version of the slides for people who want that. And yeah, so thanks again and solidarity, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Bye all.